asked a lot of questions. Sadly, don't have many answers, but we will fumble around to see what answers we can perhaps come up with during the course of the evening. The changing world. Well, obviously, the first thing that comes to mind now are all the issues concerned with the rising carbon dioxide levels and the changes in climate, warming temperatures, and the first habitats that we tend to think about as being under threat are some of these high altitude examples. And here we are up in the Cairngorm, Scotland. What evidence have we got so far? Well, we don't have an awful lot of evidence because, to be honest, at that sort of altitude, there's not an awful lot of very detailed monitoring that's going on. But there was once upon a time a field station based on Morehouse in the Northern Pennines. And we had scientists based there, and they collected quite a bit of data. And one set of data concerned the heath thrush. And there's a little tiny case moth, a coleoptera, that drills holes into the sides of the capsules of the heath thrush. And it has a little white case that sticks to the side of the seed pod, so it's easy to see. And they monitored the height up the hills to which this little case moth used to occur. And this is one of the few organisms that we've actually got good evidence to show that it's getting higher and higher up the hills now because the climate is becoming milder. But what do we actually mean by this? I mean, it's a terrible business that we're trying to work out. It's not just warmth, it's all sorts of things. I've tried to get hold of a lot of Met data, but of course the Met Office, now being partly privatised, doesn't kind of give you any Met data for free. But I did spend a lot of time looking at data I was able to get from the Oxford Botanic Gardens. And what struck me most of all was that the main increase in temperatures seemed to be the nighttime temperatures were on average warmer. Why were they warmer? Well, I think I can only put that down to the fact that it was probably cloudier at night. We've got increased cloudiness, so the nighttime temperatures are slightly warmer. We obviously know about the extremes of daytime temperatures that we keep having these odd records, but then all along the marches here we live in a rather interesting climate, which is actually, it's probably more akin to a sort of subboreal type climate in which we have extreme winter cold, as some of you will know, the lowest temperatures, what Shawbury, wasn't it? In Shropshire had some of the lowest winter temperatures, and also some of the hottest summer temperatures. So we have a climate that's really rather extreme in this part of the world compared to somewhere like Aberystwyth, which again rarely gets any particularly cold weather. Looking at the temperatures in Aberystwyth, interestingly, there were usually the odd frost. This is an Aberport data. There was the odd frost before Christmas in the past. Nowadays, you've got to go well into January before the first frost of the season, of the winter season, appears. But interestingly, the last frost of the season is just as late, if not later, than ever. 4 years ago now, my run of beans were killed in my garden in late July. That was the latest frost I've had in 50 years in that garden. So, what does the warming mean? Well, it obviously has all sorts of different implications. Cloudiness, extra rainfall. I looked at the sort of rainfall events, and I'm really worried about where all our streams going. And we could have spent the whole evening just discussing this whole business of water quality in streams. But I'm now more or less convinced that one of the biggest issues, certainly in the headwater streams where I live, is flashiness of the rivers. What I've noticed from my own Met data, which I've collected now for the best part of 30 years, is that the rainfall events have become more regularly extreme. But interestingly, the highest flows are nothing like as high as they used to be. The highest flows were always recorded when snow melted in addition to rain. We don't get the snow now. So the peak flows are not actually as high as they were, but I have a lot more high flows and they last for a lot longer. And what has happened to the stream, certainly through my garden, which was one of the best studied streams, I won't go into that now, in Wales and not in Britain, because of the field centre down the road at Newbishon-Wye. I'm now finding that following these high flow events of a week, 10 days, I think 2 years ago, it was nearly a month of high flows. When I come to look at the stones after these high flows to see what survived, I find virtually nothing has survived. The freshwater limpets are all gone, virtually all of them. You can't find any big invertebrates. It's all ground to bits. by the movement of the bed load. The bed loads are increased and this grinds away everything. And that's one of the big issues, I think, in the uplands now, is bed load caused by these extreme rainfall events. And they're made worse as well, not just because of the climate, they've been made worse because around me the forestry has been felled in huge areas, and something like 60% of the rainfall is intercepted by a dense conifer plantation and all the mosses that live underneath. Cut all those away, it looks like the atomic bomb has gone off in the valleys above me now, and 60% more water ends up in the rivers. So all this flashiness, that's made it even worse. All the hard surfaces, the heavier vehicles, the heavier machinery that the farmers are using, quad bikes everywhere, day in, day out, driving over. I think all this contributes. And we've now noticed that, and certainly when it comes to forestry operations, we knew for a long time that the bed load of streams in the forestry catchments was increased by between 20 and 30%. So if we compare one of the headwater streams in Limnam that was a sheep walk with the headwater stream that had been turned into a forestry plantation, 30% more boulders and gravel roll down those streams in the course of the year. This is a large, and that's what. So things like, we lost virtually all the crowfoot in the upper reaches of the Wye. It just got ground away because it's a very soft plant. It got ground away. Why didn't it regrow from seeds? Well, it turns out that the water crowfoot in the upper Wye is all a hybrid and it's entirely sterile. Those seeds to germinate. So we lost most of the crowfoot as a result of a fortnight, 3 weeks of really heavy rain. So all these things were all put together. So looking at, I spend a lot of time just sort of having my supper, just Googling, using Google Scholar. And you just put in a few key words and you want to know, for example, well, what's happening to plants in the uplands. And here's, this is a letter to Nature on the 12th of April 2018. And it shows an increase in the plant species richness on summits in Scandinavia, mostly in Norway. And you see the rising graphs here, showing the increase. So plants are moving up the hill. What was a rather sparse vegetation 30, 40 years ago, more plants are now able to grow as it goes higher up the hill. The length of snow cover is less. If we look at some of them, I think probably the most threatened habitat in Britain are our lake snow beds, lower plants with mosses, liverworts, lichens. They only occurred in very small areas up in the Cairngorms, and now there's hardly any big deposits of snow that persist well into the summer that provide this rather unusual habitat that's under snow for something like 10 months of the year. And that habitat, I think, we will see completely disappear in the very near future. So we're seeing, and also, I'm not sure whether it's because more people are visiting the uplands, but there's a recent little article in one of the Botanical Society bulletins showing that a lot of the tree species now, new record altitude limits have been found of late. Are they moving up the hills because of better study, or are they moving up the hills because of a more ameliorating climate? So there's one thing, this is what's happening. So what might happen to some of our Arctic alpines? Well, to be honest, this is the only Arctic alpine species, I think, that we've, genuine Arctic alpine species, which we got in Radnorshire. I think, does it occur in Herefordshire? Is it up on the Black Mountains? This is the mossy saxifrage, Saxifraga hypnoides. Wonderful big colonies of it on Aberdeen rocks. I've kept an eye on it, but it seems to be doing quite well, really. It doesn't seem to be showing any embarrassment. It obviously is able to adapt and copes well with a wide range of conditions. But if anything, I would have described Aberdeen rocks as being Mediterranean rather than Arctic alpine. So difficult to actually know what might be going on, but it would be worth checking up on a few of these species. This one concerns me particularly. This is a little creeping willow, Salix herbaceae, and it's orange because it's got a rust fungus on it. Now, some of you, if you've got willow trees in your garden, will have seen a rust fungus on the underside of the leaves. The leaves go all orange on the undersides. The undersides, I make clear. But this turns out, the genetics of it have been looked at recently. It turns out to be a distinct species. And this particular rust fungus lives and sporulates on the upper sides of the leaves, which of course is a great idea when you're living on a willow that only grows about 2 inches high. You've got to disperse your spores somehow. But then, having decided that this is a new species, it now turns out to be probably one of our rarest organisms in Britain. And so, this was recorded up on the top of Plinlimmon, and so I'm now very interested in this as a particularly scarce and threatened species, on a world scale, I admit to that. So we keep finding all these new things. What will happen to things like these Arctic alpine willows and places like Plinlimmon, I don't know. They're doing all right at the moment because the sheep have been taken off large areas, and I think sheep inhibited its regeneration. But whether we can carry on with no grazing whatsoever into the long term, what is the tree line on Plinlimmon? Well, difficult to know. I suspect that we've now got Sitka spruce growing on the summit plateau. I suspect it would all turn into a Sitka spruce plantation now, if nothing else, in due course, if we did nothing. But certainly we've seen large expanses in the population of mossy saxifrage above Plinlimmon and Rydal as a result of the sheep that are taken off. And I think that's not so much to do with climate as changes in management. So we move on through all sorts of these intriguing things. What about the other end? What about the things that love the heat and the warmth, and all these dianthus? This is the maiden pink, which Bradnor's probably got one of the best populations anywhere in Britain. This ought to be one that should be perhaps doing quite well, but it likes warm, south-facing, baking rock outcrop. So this is one of its best examples. Yeah, I thought in the past, this dear old horse has done quite a good job in grazing the bank. This is below the Llandrindod Old Church. But after a while, I'm afraid the new owners didn't have a horse, and it didn't get grazed for a long while, and that bank began to look like this, and I was really beginning to worry, because it was hardly possible to find any more than 2 or 3 plants of the dianthus still lurking there. And then we had that dry spell 2 years ago, is it now? That very dry spring, extreme drought. It scorched off most of the grass, and in no time at all, large numbers of the dianthus came back. So, all very difficult, these extremes versus the average, very difficult to know. How prone are these species to what we describe as stochastic events, they're called, if you want a posh word. These are events that happen occasionally, sporadically, often unpredictably. So we have a flora now, certainly, which is diminished because of agricultural and our development work, diminished in terms of its extent. So does that mean that the surviving populations are more liable to go extinct through these stochastic events? Very interesting. It may well be that the dianthus has a good seed bank, and that it could cope with maybe a decade of rank vegetation, as long as just occasionally we end up with a year like 3 or 4 years ago, in 1976, which scorched off all the competition. Up it comes the following year. So these predictions are pretty difficult. And then other places, this is a roadside rock outcrop just below the screen on the road that was once a railway as you come south from Aberystwyth station, heading southwards towards Llanstefan. And I have been weeding this bank now for nearly 40 wretched years. And it's getting worse and worse and worse, because in the middle of all that is the one plant for miles of the Welsh stonecrop, Sedum fosteranum. And I've been weeding this thing to try and keep it going. Where it's come from, I don't know, because strangely enough, there's loads of Sedum fosteranum in places like Stanner Rocks, and indeed it's colonised those new embankments when they widened the road past the quarries heading back into Wales. But here, it must have, I think, fallen out of the garden at the screen above. But this rock outcrop wasn't here until the railway was built. But anyway, I've kept it going, but it's got worse and worse. And now I have to clear it. Instead of clearing it once a winter, I now have to clear it 3 or 4 times a year. And at the moment, I can't even find where it is. I've lost sight of it. It's gone. It's completely swallowed up with all these nitrogen-loving herbs and great growths of bracken ferns and in this bit and brambles. We'll come back as to why so much of this vegetation might be growing so much better now in these conditions, which are marginal because the soils are very shallow. There's also, interestingly, lurking in there a wonderful little liverwort called Targeonia, which is the Mediterranean species. You think liverworts would like it moist and wet, but this is one that loves to be dried up. It curls up into a little black tube when it's very dry, and as soon as it gets wet again, it revitalises itself, comes back to life. And this is one of the few places, in fact, it's one of the, again, it's a species which I think should be a red datable species. It was supposed to be common in Devon, my daughter lives in Devon, so when I've been down there to stay with her, I thought I would have a look for population. And I've now only managed to find it once in all the populations we've done. And that population is kept going only because the school bus scrapes off the side of this bank about once or twice a year. If it didn't do it, I think we'd lose the site. If it did it too often, we'd lose the site. So it's just got to be once or twice a year. It's a hell of a place to monitor, but it's in this deep cutting, and I potter along, and every time a car turns, I have to run like hell. I can't climb up the banks to get out of the way, and there isn't room for me and the car to pass, even down this little down. But anyway, that's dependent, so that's what this poor thing is, it seems to be dependent on to keep going in Devon, is the school bus. And here it's me, just weeding it. And elsewhere, there are other important little habitats which do worry me in Ramsgate. This is above, not far from there. This is Craig Bower, above the Irwin station. And the dry turf there, this is summer droughted turf. It kills all the vegetation off during the summer because it's so dry. But a specialised vegetation lives in here, a whole range of what are called winter annuals. They germinate in the autumn, grow through the winter, flower in the early spring, and then they set seed and shrivel up by the summer. And this particular little community seems to be struggling a bit now because we don't seem to have these little regular dry spells. We have wet spells that carry on for weeks and weeks. And, the pattern of change has changed, and some of these areas are going to lose out, and maybe other species will gain. But these are things that I think would be worth monitoring. Places like Stanner Rocks. I mean, there's a nightmare of a site to manage. It's been my privilege to look after. It was for many years. God knows what's happening there now. It's a real natural resources. I think it's now in charge of the forestry people, but it's all part of the forestry. I can't seem to discover who's actually wardening it at the moment. But these dry slopes here, in some years, are just like deserts. And then another year, it can look like this. This is not my garden. This is Stanner Rocks. This is Stanner Rocks in a damp summer. And the blue flowers there are the spike speedwell, the pinks at the bottom are wild marjoram, and obviously the dog daisies there. It can look completely different again, what is likely to happen in the long term? Does this particular community, is that what it actually needs? Does it need these spells to check? Because I was getting very worried at Stanner, because Stanner used to be grazed by sheep until Herefordshire County Council bought it. And then leased it to the Forestry Commission, and so the sheep were taken off, and trees started to grow. When I got to know it first in the early 70s, I was getting really worried about the trees beginning to take over and shade out the whole place. Then suddenly we had 1976, and the drought killed huge numbers of trees. All my scrub all got killed off, and the open areas, these sort of steppe grasslands recovered. So these changes, are going on all the time. Other species you can look at. This is what interests me. I was thinking, well, this one should be. This is the stemless thistles, they call it. This is a southern species. Doesn't get into Radnorshire. It gets into Breconshire. It gets into Breconshire round. The best populations are on Manor-Llangattock, for example, on the limestone there, and also it colonises some of the disused pick tips. There's another thistle that intrigues me, and that's the melancholy thistle. And this is one of the most southerly natural populations in Britain. It's beside a barn on the main road heading north from Lambista towards Newtown. I was driving past one day and I suddenly saw all these tall thistles, thinking, great gods, what the hell is that? Because it was melancholy thistle, a northern species, probably it's native to rock ledges, along with globe flower and a few other species like that in the far north. But here we've got 3 populations for it in Ramsgate, and I'm intrigued. It seems to be struggling in all of them. if you look at the distribution maps, you'll see that the one on the right here, that's the melancholy thistle, and so here's the most southerly populations. I'm not sure what these are doing down there, but they're introductions you see there. But this is all, must probably be natural. And then here's the little stemless thistle. You can see that it's, so we might be seeing some changes, hopefully. These are two species that it would be worth monitoring to see whether, as a result of the change in climate, they might change. But it turns out, I think that both of them seem to be incredibly long-lived. I think the melancholy thistle is potentially immortal. I think it just keeps growing. As long as there's more room for it to move into, it will keep moving into that new habitat. Unfortunately, the one population has hit the tarmac now. Whether it's going to turn around and go back up the bank, I'm not sure. We seem to have almost completely lost the population in St. Harmon. There's another one struggling on the road verge. Further to the north in North Radnor. But it'd be very interesting to see what and looking at the seed production also is quite instructive. That this was a paper produced by Jumper and Woodward in 2003. They looked at seed set. So that Piggott in 1968 had noticed that Circinae cauda produced seeds regularly on south-facing slopes. And I did have a look, and the most northerly population we've got are on north-facing slopes at Craigie Keyline, the big limestone Escarpment by Crickell. And again, finding seedlings there seems to be quite difficult, but it must have got there somehow. And then they found that seeds set a mass decline towards the edge of the range in heterophyllum, and only 1.2% of the maximum seed mass was found at the southern periphery. So it's barely producing any seeds at the southern end of its range. And indeed, when you start to look for seeds, you find some wretched little beetles actually eating most of them anyway. So whether it is a pollinator problem, difficult to know. So what might happen with these plants in terms of climate change is still really rather a mystery. Another species like the meadow thistle, this is Circinae cauda, we've got some of the most important populations internationally in Mid Wales, and they hardly ever seem to set seed. Again, most of the seeds seem to be eaten. They're long-lived perennials. Roger Capps in the audience here is one of the finest populations in Radnorshire, in the Ross pasture on his farm. And it makes a stunning sight in high summer when all these solitary flowers of this thistle. But they aren't a worry for the average farmer because, of course, not producing any seed, they're not going to infest any of the surrounding fields. But that means that their ability to spread is quite limited. And there used to be quite a reasonable population on Ruscroft Common, but now it seems to have entirely hybridised out with marsh thistle. So hybridisation is another issue in terms of the survival of some of these species. Here's one that would make a good study, the mistletoe. Yeah, I've been looking at watching its distribution in Mid Wales for some while. It barely gets north of Aberedru in the Wye Valley. It just stops. It's all over all the hawthorns on the common up to the turn to Aberedru village, and it's in the orchards all the way down. Nothing beyond that. It's not, and it's been like that for the last 50 years. No sign of any change. And yet in the Severn Valley, it was very rare. I hardly knew it at all in Montgomeryshire. And now it's spread rapidly up the Severn Valley from Welshpool virtually all the way up to Newtown. You see it scattered through on a lot of the poplars and the hawthorns all the way through there. So something's changed. And there's been this one big study on mistletoe, but I'm afraid it still hasn't come to any really conclusions as to quite what's going on with mistletoe. I find it quite an amazing species, really. There was a study done on a different subspecies of mistletoe that grows on fir trees in Switzerland, and they looked at the fungi that live within the leaves and the stems of mistletoe. We now realise that lots and lots of fungi eke out of existence growing inside plants. They're called endophytes. I mean, the average number of endophytes in something like a fern frond or a palm frond or virtually every plant looked at is around about 30. And mysteriously, one of the most abundant fungi that turned up inside mistletoe in Switzerland was the scarlet waxcap. What on earth is the scarlet waxcap doing inside mistletoe, for goodness sake? So it's just impossible to even begin to comprehend what's going on there. So, is there some difference in the endophytes in the mistletoe around in the Severn Valley compared to the Wye Valley that has allowed it to spread more rapidly in the Severn Valley? I noticed the climate's always a lot milder in the Severn Valley, whereas in mid-Wales, above Aberedu, you have these murderous late frosts, and I think that's got a lot to do with it. We often see a lot of the young leaves killed on the trees if they come out too early in the spring in the Wye Valley. But when I go over into the Severn Valley, I don't see that frost damage. So I think it's something to do with this degree of frostiness, which is having a big impact on the ability of this plant to spread in different parts of Wales at the moment. And the whole business of flowering times is fascinating. There's this big study going on, isn't there, where we're all encouraged to say when we see the first flowers. And the latest report describes some sort of enigmatic results, they claimed. Well, the enigmatic results, I think, are quite easily resolvable. I got very interested in daffodils. In fact, I do give a boy silly with a whole evening's talk on daffodils, and particularly the old varieties and so on. And I was fascinated by searching for things like the Tenby daffodil down in southwest Wales. But what struck me in going down into places like Carmarthenshire and Pembrokeshire in late February and into early March was that the snowdrops were still in flower. My snowdrops had finished, had long since finished flowering. But down there, the snowdrops were late. The daffodils were early. So what's going on there? Well, it seems to me that the most plausible explanation, and I think this must be the explanation, is they have two different mechanisms for monitoring what time of the year it is. And in the snowdrops commence their growth in the autumn when the soil temperature drops to a certain level. Right? So once it gets to a certain degree of coldness, they think, well, now's the time to wake up and start growing. And so snowdrops will actually grow through snow, hence the name. Think of any other plants that do that. Things like the colt's foot, that happily will punch its way through snow, very early flowering thing. Whereas the daffodils are more inclined to coincide with flower times in accumulated day degrees in the spring. So as the springs get warmer, they get earlier as the accumulated number of degrees per day increases. So here we have a warming climate making the snowdrop flowers later and the daffodil flowers earlier. And each plant has a different mechanism, I suspect, and there's no possibility of providing a one-fits-all. I mean, things like, if you look at things like leaf drop, I'm fascinated by looking beside street lamps. You'll find, for example, a birch tree growing beside a street lamp. It doesn't shed its leaves often until way after Christmas because it's fooled, because it measures day length as a means of deciding what time of the year it is, not temperature. Day length is so important to it. Birch trees, you can't move them north-south or south-north. They don't perform very well. So because their clock mechanisms are adapted. So for example, a lot of people lost 9-10-year-old birch trees in mid-Wales when they all dropped dead one spring. And I did a bit of investigation, and it turned out they all were bought from various nurseries who had all acquired seed from Elgin on the very first in Scotland. These seeds had been sent to a nursery in England, and they then sent it to a nursery in Holland who germinated them all and sent them all back. And then these trees were then distributed as being local providence from all over wherever the nurseries grew the seedlings. And unfortunately, a lot of them, they survived very well for a long time, but then one late spring frost killed them all because they all came into leaf because of the day length. They measured, because up in Elgin, of course, they have long summer days but short winter days. So day length is important for some species, temperature important for others, and you can't easily predict as to what will happen to any individual species as a result. Connectivity, I think, is quite important. Looking at the landscape, we have this word that we're all obsessed with connectivity. we like to think about planting hedges to connect up habitats and to say woodlands. How relevant is it? Well, I thought, well, I started looking at all these hedges. This is a hedge beside a relatively new hedge. It's actually 45 years old. I started looking at 50-metre lengths of hedges that I could date. And what fascinated me was that even at 50 years, they'd acquired virtually nothing in the way of interesting plant species. Absolutely nothing. Even where they're buttered onto an ancient hedge, the bluebells in that hedge haven't moved a metre. None of these modern hedges have ferns in them. None of them have ivy in them. All the old hedges, 90% of every 50-metre length, I would find ferns and ivy in. There's been very little movement, certainly of plants, into these new hedges, even when they're butt on. So how significant are they in terms of connectivity? What do we mean by connectivity? Well, okay, they're probably quite important if you're a dormouse. But then that assumes that perhaps dormice don't travel through tall grass. I think they do. So what do we mean in that landscape by connectivity? Well, I think it's a terrible word, and I think we should substitute porosity instead. We're on a landscape that is porous to the spread of organisms and individuals. What does that actually mean? Well, I think like a lichen living on a tree trunk there, it doesn't actually have to touch another tree trunk. It has to somehow have a mechanism to get to the next tree trunk. Now, how far apart do those tree trunks have to be? And fascinatingly, we can begin to work a little bit of this out now if we study the impact of the reduction of sulfur dioxide. So sulfur dioxide killed most of the lichens off over central England and into East Wales and South Wales in particular. And then when we got rid of the sulfur dioxide about, 5-10 years ago, lichens started to return. But what species returned? It was fascinating to note that some species returned long distances very quickly. Other species were very slow at colonising. So, for example, there's a whole suite of species which occur in the Usk Valley, but still haven't got back over the Brecon Beacons into the Neath Valley. And these tend to be the species with big spores. When I say big, I mean 120 microns, so you still couldn't see them even with a hand lens. The normal spore size is about 10 to 15 microns. But the big spores found it difficult. They haven't even got over the top of the hill to be colonised, whereas others, mysteriously, have jumped great distance. We call these the zone skippers. They skip widely across the landscape. And trying to understand what's going on here, I think is going to be quite fascinating, if only we had enough data to study this and to look at it all. And I think, yes, we can see how quickly species move and how easily they are to. How many, I've got a whole range of rather wonderful little Atlantic liverworts that live on decaying logs in the Ellen Valley. How many logs do I need? How long do they live on? How long does a log prove suitable for them before it rots away? How far apart do the logs have to be? What are the propagules? There was a lovely lady that wrote a little book about her experiences of mossing in North America. And she'd made a few interesting discoveries. She spotted one particular moss which has chunky, great fragile branches. And she spotted it. It always seemed to occur in lumps at about half a metre intervals along the top of a fallen horizontal tree trunk. And she worked out that that was exactly the leap of a chipmunk. And it had been spread by chipmunks. So I start thinking, right, well, how many of these decaying logs do I need? And how do they get from one woodland to another? And of course the answer is, well, it's almost impossible to know. But looking at the type of propagules, I mean, are they very dependent on, say, woodpeckers? The woodpecker will feed on one decaying log. It will then, where does it fly next? Well, hopefully, it might fly to another decaying log, which might be some considerable distance away. Because otherwise, when I look at the number of propagules that these liverworts are producing on this one decaying log, how on earth can they produce enough of these little miserable propagules to reach another log that might be a mile away? The whole landscape would have to be covered, at every square, 10 to a square metre perhaps to hit a log. I mean, this is where I get into these smut fungi and these rust fungi. It blows my mind because I can't work out how the hell they can even continue the function. You know, either I'm missing a huge number of populations of these fungi, or I'm missing a huge number of hosts. So I've got these very rare hosts with very rare fungi, and somehow I can't see how the spore production on these very rare, how it can even manage to produce a spore which will hit the next plant of its host, which might be 50 miles away. How the hell does it get that far? You know, there's another lichen that fascinates me. It was discovered new to science on the inside of the adits of the copper mines at Coniston. It lives in the slightly illuminated zone. It doesn't like direct rainfall. It needs copper. And it reproduces mostly by vegetative granules, though it does occasionally produce spores. It probably used to occur when we had rock outcrops and cliff faces which had copper-rich rocks, but because we've exploited virtually all of these now, we don't know it's in any natural habitats. But where has it turned up? Well, I discovered it, I got used to looking for it in the old water wheel pits on the lead mines of mid-Wales. And where do I find it? I found it living on the lime mortar in these old wheel pits, underneath where the brass bearings were for the wheels. How on earth did it manage to find that habitat? And then recently I noticed a whole host of records had turned up in eastern England. Where on earth was it? But it was living on the lime mortar on church towers behind the copper lightning conductors. So how on earth does it manage to get from one copper lightning conductor to another, for God's sake? So this is this whole business of permeability, of connectiveness. Yeah, we've got to view it in a much more clever way than just thinking, oh, we'll plant a hedge between here and there, and that will make it all right. And what even annoys me more is when some bright spark comes up and says, oh, well, we don't need to bother about conserving these habitats over here because they're poorly connected. What the hell do you mean by that? Yeah, be very careful. Question. You know, don't accept disease. I mean, I'm glad that James isn't here because we could have had a good fight about keystone species. So what is a keystone species? You know, the arches, are beavers keystone species? Well, actually, of course, when you start to think about it properly, the keystone species are the primary producers. They're the plants and all those funny little microorganisms that turn chemical waste or chemicals into energy and then produce organic. So these are the producers of the organic matter that drives the rest of the ecosystem. So you've got the primary producers of the keystone. The arch is made up of the fungi and all the other fungus-like organisms that redistribute it and spread it through. The traffic on the bridge, things like beavers, that's all they are, the traffic on the bridge, the animals. Keystone to the whole ecosystem. And to think of it the other way around, I think, is just fallacious and is downright dangerous as well. So, you know, you can't have a beaver if it doesn't have a tree to feed on or vegetation to feed on. So thinking about beavers as keystone species, I think is completely the wrong way around. But anyway, you can challenge James in the next talk if he decides to adopt that particular stance with those. Anyway, moving on. Yeah, so the whole host of species that really worry me. These are the ones that need our help. This is one of my favourites. This is the wood bittervetch, Vicia oribus. It turns up in quite a lot of the old hay meadows in Midland. Not very many of them, because it doesn't like grazing. It can be grazed out quite easily. So it's in those places where it likes sunshine. It doesn't like too deep a shade. It occurs on cliff ledges very rarely, but it also turns up in some of the most wonderful old hay meadows up there. I think it's a plant we should really look after. I think it has a huge potential in the future for biomass production because it fixes its own nitrogen. You don't need to add extra nitrogen as well. But there are very few sites. We're struggling with trying to get it to establish a gillback farm. We've tried sowing seeds, that hasn't been successful, and we're now growing the plants on and planting the plants into the sward certainly in the one field where we're trying to restore an old hay meadow type vegetation. I'm not that I'm still very nervous about all this business of messing around with planting stuff in. But I think there are one or two examples, and this is one plant which I think does warrant a little bit of extra help in order to allow it to recoil. It's got very big seeds. I offered to collect seed for the Millennium Seed Bank of this. Because I thought, I know where it occurs, no problems, it produces massively seed pods, I just go out and collect them. So I waited until I thought the seed pods were right, went out, couldn't find any, not a single group of seed pods, nowhere to be seen. I sat down and thought about it, and I went out to collect Welsh poppy. There's a huge stands of Welsh poppy in the Taberado, in the wood there. Thousands of little seeds, of stalks. Not a single seed capsule left anywhere on there either. I had to sit down and think about this, and I thought, oh God, yes, I think I know what's happened. So I went back to some of these sites in the hay meadows, and I started rummaging around about 1 to 2 metres away from the plants. And sure enough, there were great heaps of all the seed capsules, all cached by the small mammals. They'd eaten every last one, gathered them all up, and so I was able to get my seeds. But what, still to this day, I have no idea. Does anybody know what eats the seed capsules off Welsh poppies? Because there was no sign of any disturbance to these big stands of leaves. Nothing big and herbivorous had obviously walked through them. Was it a bird? Was it a small mammal? I couldn't find any cached seed capsules on them either, so that's a mystery. Incidentally, it turns out that the Welsh poppies of places like Aberystwyth in the woods are genetically distinct from the ones in your garden. And even the ones in the gardens in Aberystwyth on the other side of the valley are genetically distinct from the wild ones in the wood. so there's a bit, again, connectivity of all this sort of, you've got to know the devil is in the detail. So we've got these plants then that have great difficulty moving around. And then there are other plants which do quite well. And I have to say, I think you may disagree with me, but I have to say that these are potentially immortal. And here's one of them, bracken. Bracken growing through this. He's struggling to control bracken in this meadow now for 50 years. And still the rotten thing comes back. Just occasionally, it gets hit badly by late frosts. And so it's kept in check by late frosts. But I think if you start to look for spores on bracken, I defy you to find them. About 1 year in 6, you might find a few little sporangia produced on the edge of the frond. Don't believe what some of the, there was an expert in Aberystwyth who was wanting to control bracken all the time, and he was claiming that bracken spores were carcinogenic and would kill us all. It turns out they hardly ever produce any spores. Have you ever seen a bracken spalling anywhere? I've never seen a bracken spalling in the wild. I've seen bracken spallings on where gutters have got blocked and there's a dribble down a stone wall with lime mortar. And there's little bracken spallings all the way up on the wet mortar. Because the spallings, the spores will only germinate under base-rich conditions. And yet most of the hillsides of which this are acidic. So how does that work? Well, I think I've come to the conclusion that this is probably a woodland plant. It only then produces its offspring are light demanding. The young bracken plants are light demanding. The adult plants can grow in full light, but they're also shade tolerant. I think this was designed for its spores to land on a great heap of charcoal and ashes created when a big old oak tree, say, was struck by lightning, caught fire, and created a big gap in the ground. And there on this heap of ash and on charcoal, which is quite base rich, that's where the bracken germinated. And then it lived for thousands of years after that. So some of these plants here might be the one, and of course at the end of the Ice Age, most of the soils in this part of the world were more base rich. If you dig down, for example, into the bottom of Roscoff Bog, you will find a layer of lime-rich mud. You can see the lime that was leached out. It has been leaching out ever since. This is marl, and your wood down the road here had these big pits in there, wasn't it? Yeah. Where they extracted the marl So that just show. So originally, so this bracken was able to grow in this place here because of lime-rich soils in the late glacier. It's still here today, waving two fingers in the air to all the climates. It somehow copes with even with the late frosts. So we need to know all about the individuals, the plants as individuals, and the animals that support them. The other ones that cause me immense trouble. This is heather. This is heather attacked by this heather beetle. Yes, you'll probably have seen the damage it causes up on Ireland Moor. Right, well, we can spend an evening talking about heather. All sorts of interesting interactions. Changes in climate. Ozone now. Ozone's an interesting problem. We get a lot of sunshine out in the pure air of the west here. Ozone is naturally created. But because the air is so pure, it doesn't break down at night, as it does in cities. In the cities, it gets catalysed by all the organic molecules that are pollutants in the cities. And so you start off the following day with a very low level of ozone. If we have lots of blue skies and sunshine, we end up with quite high levels of ozone. It turns out that heather's quite sensitive to ozone, and high levels of ozone mean that it doesn't turn on its winter dormancy properly. So it then becomes much more susceptible to frost. So if we end up with a sunnier climate, we end up with more ozone, and we might end up with heather being less resistant to frosts. Also, we've got this other interesting problem now with this heather beetle, which was never a problem in the old days to the grouse moor roamers, unless you were in the far western isles, in the inner isles of the Hebrides and so on. There, they always had a heather beetle problem. No frost there, the beetles seemed to do very well, didn't they? But now, the climate or something has changed, so the beetles now moving, nibble away at a few of the heather sides of the heather leaves, and as a result, the heather then loses water, and the whole thing dehydrates and dies. So we're having this big heather dieback, but a combination of all sorts of climate, ozone, you name it. No, I'm clearly not going to have time for a lot. There's a whole saga attached to introduced species. I'm going to zip past those. So this is Crassula helmsia, which has now taken over acres and acres of Bretford Pool, for example, and is spreading rapidly in this wonderful pillwork. This is Bretford Pool, solid New Zealand pigment introduced in the southern hemisphere. There's an experiment going on there. They've introduced a little mite which supposedly will reduce the vigour of it a bit. The one great beneficiary, by the way, I don't recommend paddling here. The great beneficiary is that there's a huge population now of medicinal leeches in this pond. There wasn't enough cover for them. If you come out now, all hang on to your wellies. It's really interesting. And this is the problem with it, with New Zealand clogging up where the boats dock, and Langorse Lake, for example, along places. And then we've got other things on the way. Again, this is this wonderful variegated form of yellow archangel. Origin unknown. Turns up in the garden state trade in the 1930s. Genetically distinct from ours, immune to slugs. Whereas there's 2 or 3 genetic races of our yellow archangel. I've tried to grow them side by side, and certainly the northern form of yellow archangel is just completely eaten away by slugs in my garden, and this variegated form never gets touched. So I've got huge problems now with slugs eating all my rare lichens. Lichens I've been monitoring for 40 years now appear to be disappearing rapidly because of slugs. The slugs have been given huge amounts of extra nighttime grazing time because of the milder conditions and the moisture conditions in the winter months, I think. So that's had a big impact. We'll quickly move on. The other reason why I'm interested in a lot of these lower plants, and in particular I'm interested in lichens, are these things which which colonise new surfaces. So this is an ivy leaf which has become colonised by an alga called Phycopeltis. Phycopeltis turns up, it's a tropical, subtropical alga. It turns up in the British Isles. First records are from southwest Ireland in the 1960s, and it's now spread across all of western Britain, and it clothes leaves. It disappears in a hard winter. We can't cope with the frosts. But I'm intrigued. There's a bottle of malt whiskey sitting in my cupboard, waiting to be claimed by the first lichenologist to find a lichen that lives on leaf surfaces that has Phycopeltis as its associated algal partner. because loads and loads of species in the tropics that live on leaf surfaces use Phytobeltis as their larvae partners. So these are some of the changes, and of course these leaf surfaces are created fresh each year, so that you will see a change happening rapidly, whereas elsewhere, what's going to happen to the trees, our native trees? Well, you're going to have to wait until the current trees have gone to see what trees then take over. That could take hundreds of years. It's a huge delay. But this, the delay is this is why I'm using lichens now to monitor the impacts of chicken farms and ammonia and all that sort of thing. Oh God, we're running out of time. Let's pass by the whole business of problems. This is ash dieback. This is way out in the far west of Ireland in County Clare. It's huge, this is high summer. Huge areas of dead ash out there. It's terrible, terrible. Let's move on. Yeah, move on past this. Yeah, a landscape now. This is not near St. Harman, a landscape that's now been almost completely taken over by agriculture and forestry. Very little scope, very little place for wildlife. A few studies have been carried out on individual species. This is the red-tailed bumblebee, which, or bilberry bee it's sometimes called. The bilberry bee. It feeds on bilberry in the spring, and it the spring flower very early, and it feeds on heather later in the season. But what does it do in between? And its numbers have crashed. It turns out that little bittervetch is one of its most important flowers, and so these little waysides which have got bittervetch in are very important. And it looks like the population of bittervetch has diminished quite dramatically in places like the Peak District, and as a result, the bilberry bee has declined also. It isn't able to capitalise on the spread of things like these umbellifers because other insects are in there first, like these soldier beetles. Then the other impacts of alien plants are quite significant. Yes, they can compete for space, but they also compete dramatically for pollinators. And any other plant that's growing beside impatiens and flowers at the same time, there are two issues. First of all, the impatiens tends to claim the attention of the pollinators, and even if the pollinators do end up going from the impatiens onto your wildflower like marsh moonwort, the pollen is so prolific in this that it clogs up the stigmas of the marsh moonwort. So there's about a 30% reduction in seed set on plants that live next to balsam. So that's another long-term issue as to whether this is and also these plants can dramatically affect other species. So, for example, interesting, look at the bottom line here, the balsam has led to the selection of taller strains of the orange balsam, which is another interesting species. So when the two occur together, and all sorts of interesting things. I mean, this one fascinates me. These are both lesser knapweed, but the one on the left looks like greater knapweed, and it's because it has been brought from an area where there is a lot of greater knapweed. Greater knapweed produces more nectar than lesser knapweed, and so where the two grow together, the bees tend to ignore the lesser knapweed, which doesn't have such large flowers. But where the two occur together, the lesser knapweed has evolved a form that looks like greater knapweed. That's what this is here. In order to fool the bees, it doesn't produce any more nectar, but it just looks like it. And this is the form that we tend to import when we plant these things on road verges now. A lot of the seed brought in from the continent, including this, what looks like a false greater knapweed. But it just shows again the impact of moving things around and the way it can have an impact. Yeah, we'll ignore purple loosestrife. Golden rod is an interesting one. Right, this paper is fascinating. It looked at the protein concentration in golden rod between 1842 and 2014. That's because there were lots of good herbarium specimens collected in North America over that period. And the protein concentration of the pollen had gone down by a third in recent times. And they grew to think, well, this might be a problem associated with storage. So they grew the golden rod in atmospheres of carbon dioxide that prevailed when the herbarium specimens were collected right back to the 1840s. And what they found was that the concentrations of protein mirrored the carbon dioxide concentrations. So the big problem we now have with pollinators and pollen is that it's got about in between 18. It's now dropped from 18% protein to 12% protein. So the bees are not getting enough protein out of the pollen. The pollen's there. The flowers, it's not the issue is no longer with the flowers. If I was to look at bramble leaves collected in the 1950s and compared them with brambles today, I might be able to show that there's been a decrease in the number of breathing pores in the bramble leaves by as much as over 60% in that period. There are now fewer breathing pores because the breathing pores are affected, the numbers are affected directly by the concentration of carbon dioxide. The whole point of it is to get carbon dioxide into the plant. You want to have the minimum number of stomata because they're also losing water. And water is the thing that shuts you down. I mean, what we don't realise is that often you can see a tree on a sunny day. It appears to be sitting there beautifully photosynthesising. It's actually shut down because all its stomata are closed because it's run out of water. Fascinatingly, a tree will have in its stores about 4 years worth of sugars. It can carry on respiring for 4 years without ever photosynthesising because it so regularly has to shut down because of this water. Then the upshot of it is that as a result, there's a huge diminution. Something like fewer stomata, transpiration decreases, and a reduced quantity of water. So it's taken up. So with 20% reduction in the amount of water being pulled through the plant, that's 20% less nutrients coming into the plant, the NPK. And so with that reduction in phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, it means that the protein levels have dropped also in the leaves. And with it, we've got an increase in the amount of tannins, and those tannins inhibit protein digestion. So I'm afraid that's really the cause of a lot of the loss of the bumblebees as well as the flowers. But it's also been, I think, the main cause of the loss of insects. If we moved on to the end, I can show you some graphs. Oh, bother now. These were graphs made by monitoring the moth populations in the moth trap near Aberystwyth over the space of 30 years. And I looked at each of the individual species, and what fascinated me was that some species had declined and others hadn't. Why? Well, it turned out that when I looked at it, the ones that hadn't declined were things like the footman moths. Footman moths feed on lichens. Lichens don't have stomata. Protein levels haven't changed in lichens. They haven't dropped in number. There was one moth that had defied all the odds, the Dunbar moth. Turns out that it's partly carnivorous. So all the moths that fed on leaves in high summer had a dramatic and catastrophic decline in numbers. And that's because of this increase in tannin levels in the leaves, caused by a reduction in protein, caused by a reduction in the amount of water being taken through the plant because of the reduction in stomata caused by the increase in carbon dioxide levels. And then you can add to this another factor. Yes, it's been billed as I was going to talk about fungi, so I better quickly mention mycorrhizae. There's another big paper with 90 authors on the continent which has demonstrated that as a result of the nitrogen pollution, and we're getting, 30 kilograms per hectare per year raining down over the entire landscape here at the moment. As a result of that, it's grossly affected the sorts of fungi that live on the roots and help the roots of trees and other plants take up nutrients. And we've lost, for example, the fungi such as the knights and the Cortinaria, the cobweb-gill fungi, which were very efficient at taking up phosphate from the soils, but they formed a relationship with the bacterium, and that bacterium did the mining of phosphate for the fungus, and then the fungus passed that phosphate on to the tree. So there's been a catastrophic decline in things like phosphate uptake by trees because we have altered the mycorrhizal species on the roots to favour those species that tend not to be very good at taking up phosphate. So that's that double whammy which has resulted, and that's why we don't see, I think, most of the leaves on things like oak trees defoliated. When did we last see it defoliated? I thought, am I making such a hash of managing my garden that I've managed to exterminate one of the commonest moths in my garden, which is a herald moth, which is a looper that fed on all the leaves of the oak trees. I've got all the oak trees still, I've got more oak trees than ever. No herald moths, because the leaves on the trees are no longer sufficiently nutritious for them to survive. So that's the background, I think, to a lot of, it's this understanding, having a clear understanding of what's going on. Remember, just do have a look, there's a wonderful website called Google Scholar, just call that up, and then you can just stick in any words you're interested in. But so put in butterflies and nitrogen, and you'll find, for example, perhaps an explanation why grass lays, why your ryegrass lays, which ought to be good for feeding some of the grass-feeding butterflies. Why don't they survive? Well, it turns out that once you add more than about 60 kilograms of nitrogen, virtually none of the butterfly caterpillars survive through into adulthood. We don't know why. It's the imbalance, we think, in the nitrogen content and the nutrient content of the leaves. Things like the small blue butterfly feeding on bird's foot trefoil. Bird's foot trefoil normally has 3 different species of fungi in it. If you get rid of those fungi, the bird's foot trefoil will carry on growing, and you can feed that to the common blue butterfly. But none of its caterpillars ever get through to the chrysalis stage. If you start putting these fungi back one by one, you discover quite quickly that only one of those fungi, you need one of those fungi, but only one, and that will then render the leaves of the bird's foot trefoil nutritious enough for the butterfly to carry out its entire life cycle. So this relationship between the mycorrhizal fungi, and everything is all very, very important. And by adding all the atmospheric pollutants, by adding all the fertilizer into the farm, I'm still wrestling this whole business of ammonia. It's looking to me like we're really struggling now. Your wonderful meadows up here, the birches, they're already getting a rather horrendous quantity of nitrogen from atmospheric pollutants, and I have no idea what the ammonia levels are from all the intensive livestock management about. But it's quite likely that they're now reaching a stage where certainly it's compromising the ability of caterpillars, moths and butterflies to survive on the vegetation in those fields, even though you might be managing them as best you can to whatever optimum level. So all these things, you need to have a better understanding of this all to this. It's okay, you can chuck in a few beavers, yeah, go on, do that.
Thank you very much.